Thank you very much, Jeffrey. And I do want to emphasize the element of gratitude for your opening your park and your imagination to us, walking around this park with you and engaging with the work is one of the privileges of the experiment, the project that we've started here, and, which I hope develops into an annual event. And that's where I'd like to start first. One of the things that may be not sufficiently well known is how difficult it is for academics to reach outside of the academy, to do public history, to do work that involves many of those like you who care passionately about history, but are not within the university environment. It's a risky thing to do for young scholars. For someone my age, the risks are long gone. But for young scholars, it is not easy. And I think the reasons are multiple and also related to one reason why I'm very pleased to be part of this conversation and hope that it develops into an annual event. I would like to say that your feelings about the art market are matched by my feelings about the tyranny of the individual authorial voice within the academy. That is to say, collective work is undervalued in the humanities and social sciences. Natural scientists have broken this problem long ago. But those who look for promotion, preferment, jobs in the humanities or in the social sciences, who write together or to produce things together, suffer from that. And the notion that there are problems that are simply too big for any one individual to address, that it's natural and necessary for people to come together and to talk together as a collective, runs against a kind of what I would call bareback individualism, which is the way in which the academy operates. It still does in our field, and I think that is to be deplored. And hence, any step to move towards collective work, in many respects, requires moving outside of the academy. Now, I've done it with my colleague Annette Becker in creating a museum of the history of the First World War, and God knows how many hundreds of hands and voices were involved in that. I've done it in works in television as well, and James is working in the same area. This is a kind of collective work which is a challenge to the ordering of intellectual activity within the academy. So the first point about moving outside of the academy is also related to the issue of how individuals work in groups. And I see this conversation very much as a collective conversation, which there are many different voices that I look forward to hear from the listeners and from the students who've come here, most of whom I know to be irrepressible anyway. But I think the important point to bear in mind is we are doing here something very unusual, exceptional. And I'd like to add a third point to that, of how unusual this activity is to have the privilege of working here in the place where the art was done and is being done, to work at, as it were, the pit face of a creative source of energy, artistic energy, is something I do not believe, in my experience, 40 years in the profession, I've never done this before. And I was speaking to my old friend Martin Jay, who's has at least and more experience of academic events. I don't think either of us has spoken at a site of artistic creativity with the artist among us. So it's not just that we're talking about issues of art, but we are talking about issues of the living imagination and in the place where that imagination exists. Collective work, public history, these are deviant activities within the academy, and we should I think, all be grateful for Jeffrey to having, in this building, is the perfect entity to open the doors for people to come in who do not have dwellings of this kind to work in. It's exceptional. The other point that I want to make that I think is of some importance is this, that since I came into the study of history in the 60s, Martin, you might agree or have a different take on this, by and large, people working in the fields of intellectual history, social history, labor history, which is where I started, are all living with the neighbors. That is to say, historians, I think since we began, were engaged in finding an allied discipline that could help us, philosophy or art history or economics or demography or sociology or name it. Living with the neighbors has been a very important part of the development of the study of history over the last 40 years. And in my area, the field of intellectual history, which had a good deal of social history in it, and you are one of the pioneers in this particular field, slowly but surely developed into what we now call cultural history. And that evolution over the last 40 years has many different national and maybe even regional variants. There's not one story to be told. But by and large, there has been a fruitful, maybe even essential, multidisciplinarity about the development of cultural history. Multidisciplinarity. That there hasn't been only one set of neighbors that we've dealt with, but a whole series of them. And a lot of, they've changed over time. By and large, in the 60s, when I got started, cultural history had a very, very strong French component in it. And that meant studying something which I still can't translate, Annette. Mentalité, I have no idea what it means. Mental furniture of the past, the things that you know without saying them, the way you look at the world just by virtue of breathing the air. I mean, there are lots of ways of mistranslating that phrase, but it's a mysterious one. But by and large, you needn't worry about it anymore because it's dead. And in its place, there has been a very large, again, primarily French, I think, but not only, construction of the history of representations. Now cultural history is the study of how people make sense of the past through a set of representations of the past. Now, we were walking earlier today with Jeffrey, and I was asking him, with all that, all that steel, all that metal out there, is the presumption that one should have in walking around this park, that this steel not only created extraordinary edifices in the 20th century, but as Anselm Kiefer described it, has ruined a great deal of the 20th century too, namely that steel is the language of war. And that brings me to the last point I want to raise. In particular, what I'd be interested in doing is to talk about a moment in this three-day event. It is an astonishing moment. It's a moment that fits more or less what I have tried to describe to you as the essential tasks of the intellectual activity that I've been engaged in. First of all, it's a moment of multidisciplinary work. It's a moment of collective work, and it's certainly a moment outside of the academy, and that is the Blauer Reiter moment. It's a moment in 1910, 11 to 1913, no later than that, in which some kind of transnational engagement in dealings with issues of the arts, science, and society, with all of the conflicts entailed therein, became a natural forum for the avant-garde to express their beliefs and their hopes. And in this project, the Blauer Reiters set up an almanac, or the two main leaders of it, Franz Marc and Kandinsky, set up an almanac. It was to be an annual. It's every year have one about all the best new good stuff that's coming out there. And it was blown to smithereens, to pieces. It was demolished, completely atomized by the First World War. And instead of seeing the beautiful horses of Franz Marc, he was actually killed on one, wasn't that right? Franz Marc died in the Battle of Verdun on horseback. It's, for him, the worst conceivable inversion of the project that he intended. So I thought, when Jeffrey and I got together, that the really exciting way to begin a conversation about the interaction between art, science, war, and peace in the 20th century is to start with the Blauer-Reiter group, because they did something which has never happened again. I believe that to be so. I'd be interested to be contradicted, whether there are parallels that we can say have picked up the pieces. My guess is it happened, and that is it in the 20th century. So in a degree, we're talking about a vanished dream, a lost horizon. And why it has never happened again is a question that we have to pose that leads us into the dark areas of 20th century history. Those will come, I do hope, in future forums. But this time, the question I think that we should ask is, to what extent is art multinational, or as transnational might be the best way to speak it? And to what extent do those who are interested in art and in science imbricated, located within the social and national conflicts of their own time? My guess is that in order to answer those questions in original ways, we have to speak in different tongues, in different languages. I think Jeffrey's language is all around us. His statements are there to be seen and to be listened to. Historians work in many different other languages. And one of the jobs that we have here is a serious problem of translation. It's a real one. I think it happens in many different academic disciplines anyway, but it certainly happens between creative artists and scholars, that there is a disconnect in the technical language, and maybe even in the formal language that people use. So what we have ahead of us is, I think, an interesting question of establishing translation that was exactly the problem that the Blauer-Reiter group had in front of them, because they tried to deal with everybody who was doing something interesting, no matter what their language, their background, or their disciplines. I'm not sure we're much further on than they were in 1912 or 1913. I think the language problem is still fundamental. The problem dividing the academy from creative artists is still fundamental. The problem dividing a collective like the Blauer-Reiter from individual artists or individual scholars is still fundamental. We're still engaged in the same set of interrogations as they were at that time. They were unlucky. They had the misfortune of flourishing right at the moment when the First World War destroyed what they had started. And destroyed, I think, is an understatement. What I wonder is whether we can see this conversation today as the beginning of a series of inquiries that can enable us to bring together creative art and scholarship in ways that has not happened before. I think all of us knows that it's difficult. I think it can be done, but it requires a degree of suspension of disbelief on all sides. That is to say, tolerance is not always the high point of academic excellence. Some of my colleagues are wonderful scholars, but tolerance is not one of their strongest elements. If we are able, I think, to listen between the lines, to the words not spoken, maybe to the silences too, we might be able to establish the beginning of a long conversation over many years. Jeffrey and I are both roughly the same age, 65. I'll be 66 in 2 weeks. Where this goes is as important as where we've been. And that's why I am delighted to have brought, if that's the right word, 6 students from Yale. And I think it would be good at this point, perhaps, to have them stand up and say who they are. Okay? Rose, what about you? Why don't you start? Here, there's a microphone here.
So sorry. Hi, I'm Rose Malloy. I'm an undergraduate at Yale.
What are you interested in working on in this summer and so on?
I've been working with Professor Winter on researching the First World War. This summer I'll be working on battlefield cemeteries of the Western Front and comparing English and German kind of memorial aesthetics, I suppose.
Hi, I'm Ling Xiaozhong, just call me Lin. I've also worked with Professor Winter on family relations and dynamics in upper middle class families in Britain during World War I, and I hope to continue working on that for my senior thesis.
What else are you doing this summer, Ling?
I'm going to work for an art auction house, which Mr. Rubinoff would absolutely detest. And after that, I will be going to the Imperial War Museum, to hopefully digging into the archives and looking up family details. Yes.
Sorry. I'm Chelsea James. I'm also an undergraduate at Yale, and I also took the First World War seminar with Professor Winter, and my senior thesis, hopefully, will be about Newfoundland's experience in the First World War and how the war affected them throughout the rest of the, well, part of the 20th century. So.
It's part of your family history too, then, isn't it?
Yeah, my dad's a Newfoundlander, so don't judge me.
I'm Jeremy Kessler, and I'm a PhD student at Yale, working on the history of conscientious objection in the 20th century.
My name is Jennifer Wellington. I'm also a PhD student at Yale, and I'm writing a dissertation directed by Professor Winter on the way the First World War was exhibited in museums and exhibitions in Britain and the Dominions.
Right.
Thanks. And I'd also like to welcome some of the Canadian students that we have here, two of which are staff and working for us. So Robert Denning, who is doing his master's in art history on Islamic art. And we also have Azmina, who's just beginning her PhD. Is that?
No, I'm not beginning.
Oh.
I'm actually at Simon Fraser University, but my interest has been in humanities.
Could you say that into the microphone so we can actually get it transcribed?
Hi, my name is Azmina Kassam, and I'm actually a late student, so I went back to university. But I started in the communications department, but now I'm in humanities at SFU.
And we have one more student from Victoria. And Jenny.
My name is Sarah Techley. I'm writing my master's thesis on the artwork in the new Dallas Cowboys Stadium and the theme of art in unconventional places. So.
And we have Jenny Pace-Purnell.
PhD students at UBC writing a thesis on post-war social housing and city planning, asking some of the questions about how do artists and architects try to sort of synthesize science and the arts after the war. So sort of looking back to this period is going to be really useful.
Right, well, I wanted to say that for me, having students here is essential. That it's one of the fundamental points that we talked over from the beginning, that the concept, in my view, and here we are in translation already, developing a mature conscience requires an historical perspective. There is no such thing as a mature conscience without a historical perspective. It makes no sense to me at all to talk in that way. The teaching of history is part of the formulation of what that perspective is and what that conscience emerging from that perspective might be. History, I think, to many people, is a branch of moral philosophy. Not everyone takes it that way, but I've always seen it that way. And the study of war, therefore, is a study of social and moral pathologies. Now, the subject of war, I think, is one that we should just refer to, and then I'll stop here to introduce the material. There has been a remarkable transformation in the 40 years I've been in this business, too, in the study of war itself. And it's no accident that it's been transformed, because the institutions of war have changed radically in these 40 years. From being a field of force between states, it's now a trans and subnational disease, which everyone recognizes as a perennial source of suffering, misery, and instability. Everyone realizes it. But war is not stable. It is not one set of institutions or processes, but multiple ones. And in these 40 years, people have recognized that those who look at war in the old 19th century way of doing so are not seeing what's in front of their eyes anymore and not seeing the afflictions that existed. And over time, the study of military history has taken account of this transformation slowly, in awkward ways, by being turned into the study of war and society, which is not the same as military history. This is also a shift in gender perspectives. The study of war and society is no longer boys and their toys. It's no longer a male discipline looking at male activities at all. It's looking at how societies go to war and how they suffer the consequences, from the smallest to the largest, to the towns in Canada in the case of the First or the Second World War and so on. So we have, I think, a subject, art, science, war in the 20th century, each element of which is dynamic and unstable. And as a result of this, I think, we have quite a substantial task in front of us, is to know how to control these extraordinarily difficult fields, art, science, and war, and to bring them together in original ways. And my suggestion has been, and we've worked this through this year, I hope we can do it again next year, is to find a miniature focal point, literally to build out of a small story something which is much bigger. To choose from a small group of people publishing in Munich something about the nature of the interaction of these three elements before 1914. In the 1920s, there are many instances we could think about. Dada might be an interesting example to choose, or surrealism might be one. But there are numerous cases in which what I would describe as the ossification of disciplines haven't happened yet, in which artists had the right to speak about science, scientists had the right to speak about art, and everyone had the right to speak about war because war was part of their lives. Only later in the 20th century, I think, we become disciplinarily atrophied. And I'm not sure that was so earlier. I'm not sure it was so before the explosion of university studies in the 1950s or 1960s. But certainly, we can register the fact that if we can choose small enough incidents or small enough groups, we can do something about much larger fields of intellectual activity. So the final point that I wanted to make is that this is, for me, very much a beginning. This is a prelude to a unique opportunity for which, Jeffrey, I must thank you for your patience and forbearance of people who speak a barbaric language. And I hope that everyone here realizes that the only way in which to make this happen is for it to be a real conversation. We have things to say, we've written papers and so on, but this is the opening of the door through which we all have to pass. The more conversation we have, the better about the challenging statements that I think we're going to hear in the course of the next couple of days. But above all, I would like this to be considered a conversation with your art and your work. And hence, each time that we have an intervention, I'm interested to hear what you have to say about it, which statements in the place where your creative work happens carries a weight which we cannot ignore, and we shouldn't ignore. What we can do with this, I hope someday, maybe in a year or two, is think about publication. This is too soon. We need to think about the forms and so on, but I can tell you that the essays that were done by my colleagues ought to be in print. If I get the English right, Annette. I apologize immediately for some of my creative misinterpretation of her French. But then we've had it. No, that's what I say. It's creative misinterpretation of the French. But we've had a wonderfully robust relationship despite creatively misinterpreting each other for decades now. It's been perfectly possible to do that. But I do believe that publication matters, and that the exchange of ideas in a room like this, which is critical, ought to have an echo. It ought to be in the public domain. Now, I know we are recording this, and that is one form of it. The internet is another. The website of the Sculpture Park and so on should be certainly available. But I hope everyone in this room remains open to the possibility that we're actually engaging in a series of interrogations that have real potential for interesting people in all kinds of places, in all kinds of worlds, that are unfortunately individuals who are unable to come. The final point I want to make is this, that I am the author of two papers here, not because I wanted to do it, but because I had to. The historian of science who agreed to come, John Heilbronn, who's one of the great historians of science anywhere and former vice chancellor, isn't it, of your university, of Berkeley? What was it called? Something like that, right. Someone who ran the University of California at Berkeley, John Heilbronn, is also a biographer of Galileo and a great student of Max Planck and of 18th century astrology, architecture, and other such. I mean, a man of enormous talent. And having him come here would have been just delightful. The problem is Yale University pulled the rug out from under our feet by awarding him an honorary doctorate tomorrow. So he couldn't come. Hence, to cover, as it were, the absence, the silence that resulted in his withdrawal, I had to go back to my early years. And in a way, we're both doing that, Jeffrey, in some respects. Because my first teacher at university in history, Fritz Stern, is someone I very much want to keep in mind here, because his godfather was Fritz Haber, one of the great figures of the 20th century in the history of chemistry. A man who won the Nobel Prize for work in synthetic chemistry, but never escaped the opprobrium from his contribution to poison gas warfare on the German side in the First World War. And hence, going back to those exchanges I had with Fritz Stern, he ran a seminar in the First World War, 1965, at Columbia University, and I'm still in it. Going back to that is, in a way, returning to a moment that I think you and I both agree mattered a lot. That somehow in the 1960s, among the many bouleversements, among the many disruptions, art and history got separated. Now, why that happened, there are others in this room who know better than I. That it happened, I think we can agree. And the challenge is to bring them together again. Now, I admit the frailty of the effort, certainly on my part. But a collective is much larger than the sum of its parts. And if we can keep this effort going annually, I think we have an occasion that can find allies and other individuals, our colleagues in the Histoire de la Grande Guerre, and Perron is one group that I have in mind. I'm sure there are others, who can help us see this collective project through of bringing art and history together in a creative embrace. Whether we succeed is obviously up to the participants, but that the effort is necessary, and necessary for the construction of what you referred to as a mature conscience, I'm absolutely persuaded. That's essential. How we get there is for others to contribute to as well, and I look forward to hearing what everyone has to say. Step by step, critically all the way through, and indeed after the end of this meeting as well. So once again, Jeffrey, thank you for making this wonderful space available to us and for welcoming our students who, after all, are going to carry on where we leave off, whether we like it or not. So in that spirit, I would like to open the conversation and to see if we can perhaps follow the initial discussion with a first presentation by Jeffrey, after which I think we will have an awful lot to talk about in conversation among the participants around the table or indeed in the hall as well. Is that the way you wanted to do it? Good. Right.
I'm going to start with a slide review. I'll be showing work that some of you will know very well. Some of you may not have had even an art course for the last 20 or 30 years. So it will bring us up to date into this particular period, and where I'm going to start is with the Chauvet Cave. So I showed these last year as part of the, to show the fusion of the quality of work within the caves with a number of figures from the history of art. Now, last year I showed the fusion because the idea of the fusion between the subject the artist and the subject is really a very, very important part of source of original art. So when I talk about art, I'm basically talking about original art. I'm not talking about other functions that art has taken. Last year I discussed those. This year I have no intention of discussing those. But I do want to review the cave art. I think it's very important. So we start with the Chauvet Cave, which has now been dated to about 36,000 years ago. Now this 36,000 years is 36,000 years of genuine art history. The quality of this work is outstanding. It's a little weaker in Chauvet. The Lascaux Cave is about 17,000 years ago, and it is extraordinary. So, and then I will show Altamira, which is around the same time. So this is late Paleolithic times. The surprise in the Chauvet Cave is no one thought that art dated back this far. I want to point out that the work in the caves, in its extraordinariness, is not primitive in any way, shape, or form. And this, the reason why I'm showing this again is that these caves weren't available as a source of knowledge to the artist in the early part of the 20th century. Although Altamira was discovered in 1870 and became a great tourist attraction, nobody really knew what it was because carbon dating didn't come into being until 1949. So the information that was available, and Lascaux was discovered in 1940 and Chauvet in 1994. So the consequences of this is that the artist had no idea that this work existed. What's amazing about the Chauvet Cave is its centered radius. It's within 300 miles of Paris and it's 300 miles of Florence. So this is an amazing part of European history that these caves represent. And I found it very unfortunate that the Europeans had a tendency to collect what they called primitive art. Now that primitive art is really the trust and the legacy of other cultures. It is not primitive art. That is European condescension. So I found it really, really quite upsetting where we can find in the almanac, and even what the artists were doing in collecting African masks and other things, they may be interesting to look at, but to those cultures, they're a craft. And I need to remind myself often, and it will be mentioned in this paper as well, that for 5,000 years of civilization, artists have been petty functionaries. And by petty functionaries, what I mean is that 1% of the population, basically the warrior class, were on top, and 99% of the people were slaves, and literally slaves within most of that age of civilization. So the escape to petty functionary was huge. This is really important because otherwise the work was bone crushing. You were either working in quarries. Farm work was not driving a John Deere tractor with air conditioning. It was lifting big rocks and moving things out of the way. It was terrible. Or soldiering. So to be elevated to be a petty functionary actually was a great deal. And the petty function that they had was the ability to, from their ability to mimesis, to create monuments to the ruling class. That's what they did. That was their petty function. So it's not until 1874 when we see that break again, and that's when the middle class had grown enough from the Enlightenment to actually create a pool, a genetic pool of artists from the middle class. And that genetic pool from the middle class, as we'll see beyond this, is a group of independents who in 1874 created their own show. I won't use the word ism for any of these people. This is an important part of the way that I look at it. Isms tend to be attached to ideas of doctrine and ideology or beliefs or any number of other things. These are individual artists, and when we deal with original art, what we're really talking about are singularities. And so it's important to know that as we go through this slide presentation, the people who are known as the Impressionists, I call the Independents, and the reason why is that Impressionism, and I'll show the first painting that is referred to, began as an epithet, and it was done by a writer by the name of Louis Leroy in a satirical magazine called the Chiavari, and this began the idea of applying epithets to modernism, and so that also was true of Cubism. It was true of the Fauves. Even worse with the Fauves. Fauves means wild beasts. So I want to show that there's a 35,000-year history of art. That's the art by artists, and I want to, I've communicated in walking around and showing the work from my own perspective, is that these artists code originality into the work. And what you can suppose about these caves, and I think very well so, from an artist's point of view, is the high quality of the work itself, number one. And number two, the importance that they were given within the cave. We're certainly not going to choose the hack artists in order to do this. These caves were very, very important to them. They're beautiful caves, they're deep, they run deeply, and the quality of the work is outstanding from an artist's point of view. So this is not primitive art, and that's what I want to point out. This is high-level art, and it's in last year's presentation, I communicated that what's really important from judging an artist's work is based on the concept that I have that he's mapping the human soul. And by the human soul, I mean all of the all human knowledge, and I can't see that it can be any less. So the sum of all human knowledge is really a clear definition of the human soul to me, and I can't believe that it can be any less. You can't exclude anything, and that means knowledge of things that were once to be thought true and then no longer perceived to be true. So the artist maps his area of what's known in his time. So when we look at this work, we have to look at what they knew in their time. There was no civilization. They were doing what they were doing, and so we go back and judge them from the perspective of what they could possibly know. And so I'm going to begin this, and I want to show the work again, and it will begin with the 35,000 years ago, and then we'll work up into a second presentation.
Pointed at that white box.
At that white box. Right there?
Go forward.
Forward. Forward? Where's forward? There we go. Okay, this is this picture is from the Chauvet Cave. As I said, it's 36,000 years old. Chauvet again. These are on the ceilings of the cave, and this is really important. This is very difficult work to do. This is work that requires the ability to do this work in perspective overhead. Ah. No, there, did it. We see horses. These horses were food. Ah. No. Oh, okay. Okay, got it. Oh, now it's going on its own. All right. amazing to think of a rhinoceros in the south of France. These are cats. And I find these cats absolutely amazing. There's 3 of them here. And more cats. And I don't know what the relationship were with these cats. These cats don't appear in future caves. So either they ate them or they just simply killed them as predators. But these are really amazing, amazing drawings. Bison, of course. Now this is Lascaux, so you can see this one much more clearly. You can see how the work is on the ceiling of the cave. Lascaux again. This is Lascaux. This ibis is done with a few strokes. This is amazing work. This is an abstract painting out of Lascaux. I don't know. It so surprised me when I came across it. I was actually floored by that. This is Altamira, and these bison on this roof are they're just absolutely incredible. That's pure futurism. Sculpture. Okay, so we've done the cave. So the next one is to do the artist. So I've started back in 1874, and there's a reason for this. I want to show the first quote-unquote impressionist painting. So that's the reason. It's called Impressions of the Seine, and it's by Monet. Then we'll go to Cézanne, Van Gogh, and Gauguin. And the reason for that is that just about every modernist between 1900 and 1914 attributes the background of their work to those 3 artists. So that's the famous, infamous painting. And in fact, what happened at that particular stage was that those artists as independents, most of them, and it may only, I've read that it's possibly only Renoir, each of them had an independent income. This is really important because when they did their independent show, they did it independent of the Salon, the Paris Salon, which was the important one at that point, which had, in a sense, a monopoly on what art was going to be sold. And when they made this independent statement, they were not only making an independent statement about the individual work itself because it was rejected from the Salon, but they also were on top of the market itself. And this was incredible because it lasted almost no time at all. This is Cézanne, and each painter or each group of painters has really strongly attributed their base for doing this work on one of them, or almost all of them, all of them will do bathers or dancers, and all of them attribute it to this particular painting, oddly enough. This is paintings that he did in Provence, and out of it, when Cubism, another epithet, by the way, was applied to it, the thinking was that it grew out of this work, this particular series of work by Cézanne, and Picasso himself called Cézanne his father. Okay, come on. Come on. Obviously Cézanne. Now, the other thing that people attribute to Cézanne is the flatness of the space. So we begin to see the flattening of space and elements of the flattening of space as modernism progresses. This is Van Gogh at Arles. In fact, all three of these are from Arles. It's time at Arles. Come on, okay. You can actually see the relationships among all of these works, among the pieces that I've chosen. Gauguin, of course. Notice the big flattened color areas. Again, we'll see that repeated in Matisse. And that again in Matisse, the big flat colors. So that's Gauguin as well. This is the Burghers of Calais, and I add it because of the importance to me of Rodin himself. This is a beautiful piece. It's almost truly figurative. It's a wonderful composition. But the most important part about Rodin to me is that he single-handedly rescued sculpture from the scrap heap of history. After Martin Luther went to Rome, he not only had an attack on indulgences, he had an attack on the physicality or the wealth that he saw in Rome, and sculpture was going to be the first thing that really fell hard. I think he had a friendship with Carnap, so painting managed to survive, but from this point on, from that point afterwards, and he's a contemporary of Michelangelo, from Michelangelo to the time of Rodin, there's nothing but statuary, and there's no art in sculpture. I haven't seen any from the death of Michelangelo until Rodin himself. He spent time in 1876 on going to Florence and really studying what Michelangelo had done. And when he came back, he actually revived the art of sculpture. So I have a great debt to that, even though this is purely figurative. The composition is extraordinary. And the story, well, I won't get into the story. The stories are really, really terrific as well. This is the Blue Nude. This is Matisse. We're dealing with the wild beasts. Matisse again, and you can see how that flat structure that I showed you in Gauguin is like existent. And these are bathers again. This is the dance. You can see this painting in the Museum of Modern Art. So this painting's in New York. This is Lemenck. He was one of the Fauves, even though he seems to have a Dutch name, he's actually French, and worked in Paris with Matisse. This is Derain, also another Fauve, also working with Matisse. And of course, maybe one of the most famous paintings ever. I don't know. Now, Mona Lisa's probably more famous. This is Les Demoiselles d'Avignon, and these are, this is a whorehouse in Paris. So It even shocked, apparently, the artists of the time, and Picasso actually didn't show it until, I think, the 1920s. But it was done in 1906, I believe. 6? 7? 7? Okay, we'll give it 1907. Picasso again. This is from the Cubism, and I think that you can pretty much see that relationship with those Cézanne, with that Cézanne. Again, Picasso. This is Braque, and this is a little later Braque, but I put it in because it's almost impossible to tell the difference between Braque and Picasso. They actually work together, and I can make that mistake. So I purposely put this in so that I had a transition to Braque. This is Braque. This is Braque. Now, this is Picabia. Also, Picabia, in the time of the 1913 Armory show, he was the only one of the Parisian artists working in this mode who actually went to New York. Léger, Fernand Léger. And Juan Gris. Juan Gris is actually Spanish, but he was working in Paris as well. And this is Jacques Villon. We're going to deal with different Villons here. Villon is a name that there were 3 Duchamp brothers. There was Jacques, Raymond Duchamp Villon, and of course Marcel Duchamp. They adopted Villon. I don't quite know why. It wasn't even a family name, but I think they did it in order to differentiate among the brothers. So Jacques took on the name Jacques Villon, and this is one of his paintings, and that fits in with with that mode of work. This is Robert Delaunay. And he worked a little more independently. So this is also Robert Delaunay. So these are 3 Delaunays in a row. What I've done is I've chosen to take 3 pieces of each more influential artist and less influential artists. So we'll see. So these are quite influential. Of course, this one is Marcel, and this is Nude Descending the Staircase. When this piece was shown in the 1913 Armory show, it gathered crowds. This is like, I don't know why. It was what gathered people around in the 1913 Armory show, and it generated an enormous amount of vilification of both the artist and the art form. This is also Marcel Duchamp. This is chess players. It's from the period. And now before we giggle, this is a ready-made. Now this is ready-made, happens to be in New York, and there'll be more about ready-mades when I get to my paper. That's Marcel Duchamp as well. This is Mondrian. It's not necessarily the way we think about Mondrian. This is an earlier Mondrian, and probably a much more likable Mondrian. This is Baccioni. Now, Baccioni is famous for that awful, awful sculpture, which I need to raise a question here. It's kind of an agreement, I think, should be an unwritten agreement between sculptors and painters. Painters don't do sculpture, and sculptors won't do painting. And I think I'd probably like to see that in writing. That's one of the worst sculptures I've ever seen. That's the unique forms of motion in space by Baccioni. Everybody shows it. I won't. I think it's a piece of crap. I think it's terrible. However, he could paint. And whether you like this painting or not, this is a futurist painting, and this is Baccioni, and it's called The City Rises. And it's easy to hate. However, there's a lot of action in it, and remember what I said about action in those in Altamira. Oh, come on. Oh, got it wrong. This is also Baccioni. One of the problems that I found with the Futurist paintings, apart from their terrible philosophy, was that a lot of them tried to design modern painting rather than paint modern painting. So at least I don't have that irritation with Baccioni. He's the only Futurist I'm going to show. This is Kirchner. This is another school in Germany. I don't know, rather than the Blue Rider, there were two schools that went. They began with a new secession, which I really didn't put much in from. The Max Beckmann that I have available to me are much later. And so I don't have much early Beckmann. And I wasn't that big on the new secession anyway. But this is Kirchner. And when I took the modernist course when I was in university from the person who also became my painting mentor, I remember he died in 1970, but I remember this particular painting, so I decided to put it in as a start for Kirchner. Now, he was part of a group that worked both in Dresden and then in Berlin called Der Brücke, the bridge, and they dissipated in 1913. This is also Kirchner, and this is also Kirchner. But I think you can see a lot of the relationships of how these painters learned from, or actually worked out different problems very similarly, and they were working on elements themselves, the elements. This is Schmidt-Rottluff, and Schmidt-Rottluff was also a member of Der Brücke, whatever that means. They weren't a movement. The Expressionists, at least among the artists, Expressionism never really took on an epithet connotation, and they never really saw it particularly as pejorative. And I have to say that the artists who, once these epithets were applied, they used it for marketing, and so they themselves would even use the term in order to create their own markets for those things. So that the Cubists became the Cubists, even though they knew that it was insulting. And who wouldn't want to be called the wild beast? So they actually took these names on. Expressionism is a little bit different. It doesn't really have any known weight or where it came from. I guess they needed something that was different than Impressionism, and at one time Impressionism was called Expressionism, so that these things passed back and forth, but gradually it stuck. And these taxonomies, as I said, mean nothing to artists. They're individuals, and I think that it's very important to be able to see artists as singularities, especially original artists, and see them as singularities, and see them as clusters of singularities. That's important. This is also Schmidt-Rottluff. And also Schmidt-Rottluff. This painting, I think, is at MoMA. I think you can see this one in New York. And, oh, come on, give me my Pechstein back. This is Pechstein, also a member of Der Brücke. And this is Heckel, also a member of Der Brücke. This is Emil Nolde, and I put this one in for Vaughn. Emil Nolde did a lot of different kinds of paintings, but this one is probably among the more abstract, and again, you can see this relationship with Van Gogh. Also Der Brücke. And Oskar Kokoschka, this painting is at MoMA. He kind of existed individually, and I won't talk about his wartime activities. Come on. Okay, well, okay. This is early Kandinsky. We're dealing with Kandinsky before 1914. So this is Kandinsky. Not great. Okay, this is Kandinsky. Of course, we're into the Blue Rider now. And this is Franz Marc. This is one of the Blue Horses. Tiger. There's a cat. This one's in Munich. Yeah. And Mandrill. This one's called Mandrill. Now we're getting extremely abstract. This is Jolensky, also a member of the Blue Rider group. Also Jolensky. This is Maka, and he didn't do very many paintings, and I don't know how many great ones he did or not. He's given a lot of credit, but he did die within 2 weeks of the start of the war. This is a pretty good painting. And this is Gabriela Munter, and it's actually a portrait of another member, Verifkin, of the portrait of Marianne Verifkin, who was also a member of the Blue Rider. This is Otto Dix, which I showed from last year, and of course this one's from 1932. The reason I'm showing it again is that it's going to be part of my paper. And I'm showing George Groves, also part of my paper. This one's, I think, from 1922 or so. And now we get to some sculpture. This is Raymond Duchamp-Villon, the other Duchamp brother, and he died late in the war. I think he maybe died of typhus. But he died late in the war, just after the war. I can't remember when. He didn't do very many pieces, but this piece, you can see it's Pompidou, and it's fairly common around. I think there's a large number of these done. This is called the large horse. This is Archipenko. Archipenko was a Russian, maybe Ukrainian, who knows. That area at that particular time is pretty hard to identify. He came to Paris. He worked in Paris at this particular time, and then he came to America in I think 1923 or 26. I can't remember, but one of those years. But these are from this particular period. So this is Archipenko. There's not much sculpture. This is also Archipenko. There's not much sculpture at any time. What we really have to look at quite realistically, there's probably 100 painters to about every sculptor at any given time. This is also Archipenko. And also Archipenko. This one is at the Guggenheim. The Guggenheim, this is part of their permanent collection. Brancusi. Well, I need not say more. Brancusi. Come on. Show me my Brancusi. This is just dwell on that. This one was shown at the Armory show. And Brancusi once more. And of course, I had to end with sculpture, so I did. So that kind of brings us up to the breadth and quality of the work that was done in that particular period of time.
Jeff, just quickly with your permission, I know you have your paper to present, And then we have discussion. I just want to know if we could take a short break for pee break, coffee, and something like that, so we can
Sure.
all be alert.
Sure.
So can, first of all, just,
You mean I'm putting people to sleep already?
well, no, I'm just saying that all your introductions and Jay's introduction and all of this slideshow has
okay.
gone on a little longer than we planned, which is okay. It's all necessary. But if we could take really just 5 minutes and people could have a stretch, and the bathrooms are in the back, and I think there might be some refreshments. Grab yourself a drink, and then we'll meet back in 5 minutes for the presentation.